Welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast, where we talk to C-level leaders from across the payments landscape. We'll be discussing the products and services that impact the payment space today, as well as trends and predictions for the future of payments. We will also hear stories from our guests about their journeys to the top.
Hi, Steve. Welcome to this special series of the Leaders in Payments podcast about financial inclusion. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much, Greg. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. So we've had you on the show before, so you were on back in August. But if you don't mind, give us a reminder a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, where you went to school, where you currently live, a few things like that.
Sure. I am Canadian by heritage, if you're allowed to be Canadian by heritage. But I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in and around Vancouver, Canada. I went to University of British Columbia with an undergrad in molecular biology and computer science. And I currently live in beautiful Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh, okay. One of the payment hubs of the U.S. these days.
Absolutely. This is fintech, right?
Right, absolutely. Well, before we dive into financial inclusion, obviously that's the theme of this month. Let's talk a little bit about Instant Financial. Do you mind telling the audience what Instant Financial does?
Sure. Instant Financial is the pioneer of no fee, no interest earned wage access. So we provide the service to mid and large size employers who in turn roll Instant out as a key benefit for their employees. And these employees now have access to some of their earnings within the standard pay cycle. Again, no charges, no fees, no interest. We're really putting employees in control of their pay without disrupting the payroll cycle or the payroll systems that the employer has in place.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you're one of the founders there, right?
Yes, I'm one of the founders. I was the founding CEO of the company and came back to serve Instant after a little bit of a hiatus back in May, and now serve Instant as the Chief Operations Officer.
All right, well, let's dive in and start talking about how Instant Financial is helping to support financial inclusion. And I think I got this from your website, but your vision is a world where living paycheck to paycheck is extinct. So how is Instant Financial helping to make that happen?
Yeah, so by putting employees in control of their pay, letting them access some of their earnings whenever they want, we're removing the confines of this notion of living paycheck to paycheck. Actually, when we founded the company back in 2015, half of the country, about 50% of working Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And interestingly, Greg, that problem has gotten worse. It's about 80% today of working Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So instead of forcing these employees to turn to so-called alternative financial services to make ends meet between paychecks, we let the employee have access to their own earnings so they can take an instant pay at the end of their day and go to the gas station or go to the grocery store, take home a few bags of groceries to the family. So use their own earnings to make ends meet, essentially solving for that paycheck to paycheck problem. Said a different way, Greg, I guess one way to think about it is when farmers are growing whatever food you want to talk, when they're growing corn, they don't flood the plain every 2 weeks, right? There's a sprinkler. And every single day they sprinkle out. And that's kind of the nature of health, having a little trickle every single day. And so we took essentially the same principle and applied it to payroll. Can we allow people to uplift their financial wellness? So by instead of flooding the plane every 2 weeks with a paycheck and then this kind of feast and famine sort of behavior that most of working America deals with today, can we provide a healthier environment by letting employees have access to earnings whenever they want instead of being confined to this biweekly paycheck? And that's exactly what we see. We see employees standing taller at work because they're able to access their money whenever they want. They don't have to borrow from each other. They don't have to borrow from a manager. They don't have to turn, like I was saying, to alternative financial services and pay a bunch of interest or fees or what have you on these other services when they run a little short of cash in hand between paychecks.
Do they have to have a checking account?
Absolutely not. So really what we did is we built a service that allows effectively every employee to participate in the program. So if someone has their own account, they can take their instant pay and move money to their own account if they'd like. We also give them the instant prepaid Visa debit card. So effectively giving them real-time access to their earnings and their instant pay or instant tips, whatever kind of services the employer has rolled out from Instant. And that prepaid Visa debit card gives them instant access without any fees or charges to those earnings. So effectively, every employee at any of our clients can participate in the program, whether they have a checking account or not. And in fact, we don't do credit checks. We're not looking for a specific FICO. As you know, there's 122 million Americans that fall under the 660 FICO level. And so we really wanted to build a service that would provide this financial wellness benefit broadly to all working Americans.
I think one of the things that I have found very interesting about your sort of product offering versus others is you're not charging fees to the employee or really to the employer, right?
Absolutely correct. That's right. No fees to the employee to access their earnings, no fees to the employer, and no cash flow impact to the employer either, where Instant is actually funding the earned wage access advances that are being taken by the employee.
It's interesting because I think when you hear earned wage access as sort of that phrase, you don't really realize that that can actually, in some solutions, I think, cost the employee money to actually get access to their own wages.
I know it's your podcast, Greg, but let me turn this for a second. Let me ask you a question. If you are paying fees to access earnings, I mean, doesn't that sound a lot like payday lending?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not sure about you, but I've never heard of payday lending and financial wellness or inclusion really kind of being married together in a positive statement. So no, we've been very, very careful, and we've done the hard work to craft a program that doesn't reach into the pockets of hardworking, sometimes vulnerable working Americans. We think that's just way too close to the payday lending industry. And I mean, I don't sit here shaking my fist at payday lending. It's a very tough environment and it's regulated now. And so there's a lot of people paying attention to that space. We did not want to found yet another lazy financial service that was monetizing, Greg, people's most financially vulnerable moments, right? We took a different approach and said, as an example, when a worker at a McDonald's finishes her shift and she goes to the parking lot and turns the key on her car and the empty light's on the gas tank, that's the moment in time where most financial services take advantage of that financially vulnerable moment, right? Instant philosophically took a very, very different approach. We said at that moment in time, let's be there for her. Instant's there for her with fee-free, no interest, instant pay so that we can earn the right to be her long-term trusted financial partner. So that's really our model. It's very different from the transactional or subscription or some models that ask for a tip or a handout for the service that they provide. We took a very, very different model, and we think this is the right model for earned wage access.
Hey everyone, this is your host, Greg Myers, and as many of you already know, October is Financial Inclusion Month, and we're going to be talking about all of the products, services, and ways that the payments and fintech industry helps support the underbanked and unbanked. A special thanks to our title sponsors, The Clearinghouse and PaySafe Cash, as well as our principal sponsor, Instant Financial. Now, back to the show. You mentioned a little bit ago the phrase financial wellness, and I know that's a huge value proposition for Instant Financial. Do you mind speaking to what that means to you guys?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been building out my true financial wellness roadmap for about 15 years now, 16 years in fintech. And I'd say talking about financial wellness is almost lazy at worst and very, very aspirational at best. And so when we're looking at the kind of daily life of most of working America, we took a different approach and said, if we're going to get to financial wellness, if we're going to get working Americans to be financially healthy, we first have to recognize where most of the working population is. They're financially vulnerable. So we have to first lift financially vulnerable Americans to being financially coping And then we can talk about graduating them from being coping to being financially healthy. So we don't just talk about financial wellness just because it's great SEO and it's kind of a conversation that's going on right now. This is based on my financial wellness roadmap, my true financial wellness roadmap, which really talks about moving from being vulnerable to coping and then being provided tools that will actually allow you to graduate to being financially healthy.
Okay. And I think we all know that having access to your pay, I mean, you've kind of already talked about it. It isn't necessarily equal for everyone, right? There's certainly barriers for the underserved communities. So can you speak to some of those barriers and then what you guys are doing to help overcome some of those?
Yeah, I mean, and that's really, Greg, the focus of where we started from a vision and mission perspective. It was really, let's help the underbanked, the underserved, the unbanked. But what's interesting is over the last 6 years since we founded the company, I mean, Instant is very much being used by all employees, effectively, irrespective of kind of where they fit on the socioeconomic scale, if you will. And I'll get into that in just a second. But in fintech, we all hear these numbers that almost half the country can't pay their bills on time. More than half the country doesn't have access to $400 for an emergency expense, that 60 to 70% of the country is unable to save any portions of their earnings. And those are kind of the metrics that haunted us that we really wanted to solve for. Put employees in control of their pay, and by doing so, prevent the poor tax. And Greg, what I mean by that, I think that 2019, 2020, as you know, during COVID, the uses of alternative financial services and kind of the fees paid by consumers into those services was kind of all over the map. And plus, it was kind of a pandemic year. So if we go back to 2020, I believe there's $196 billion paid into the underserved market, right? The revenue driven by so-called alternative financial services. So if you divide that $196 billion by the 63 million underserved US adults, that's $3,117 that comes out of the pockets of these vulnerable working Americans each year. I call that the poor tax. And I call it the poor tax because it's ineloquent, it kicks in the shin, but it draws attention to what the real problem here is. So by putting employees in control of their pay, we're attempting to keep vulnerable working Americans from having to participate in this poor tax. So there's a lot of conversations, as you know, in terms of minimum wage reform, benefits being provided to both part-time as well as full-time employees, whether someone's a W-2 or a 1099 based on the type of work they're doing. So our vision is really very separate from all of those conversations. By giving employees no fee, no interest access, timely access rather, to their earnings when they need it, I want to put this $3,117 back into people's pockets and actually absolutely obliterate this so-called poor tax. I think that's the bedrock of financial wellness and what really Instant's vision and mission is all about. So talking earlier about just kind of the underserved, underbanked, and what's really interesting for us, I mean, Greg, we see over 50% employee participation in Instant. And that's the average. We have some bright, shining clients that have 90, 95, Greg, 99.4% employee participation in Instant. It's like a benefits participation like no other benefit that's offered by an employer. So as you can imagine, those sort of participation levels are well beyond your underserved or underbanked employees. Today in 2021, earned wage access is here. It's staying, and we're seeing all categories of employees opting in to participate in Instant Pay.
That's very interesting. And talking about some of the stats and the studies, it seems like from what I've read and seen out there, the number of underbanked and unbanked over the last 10 years in the U.S. has decreased, which obviously is great. but the percentage of unbanked and underbanked in minority populations remains, I'll say, higher than it should be. So any thoughts on how we can continue to lower the percentages in those minority groups?
Yeah, I think, Greg, when you look at the employment of the vulnerable populations, right, from an ethnicity or sociogeographic perspective, they're typically working hourly work, and they're usually multiple jobs that are being worked. And so the key there is that they don't have access to a lot of benefits. Frankly, a lot of benefits that many of us take for granted, right? So not having those benefits is resulting in a lot of additional expenses for these people. So our perspective is that our world is all about earned wage access. So that's really where we feel we can have an impact. So we wanted to make sure that we crafted a program that was available to all employees to help assist vulnerable workers that may or may not have access to benefits from the employer. So that's kind of the instant model, if you will. It's a benefit that's being provided to the entire employee population. And I believe Instant's doing its part to help the underserved.
What else, in your opinion, do you think payments and or fintech, if you want to lump those together, what should we be doing to help with financial inclusion?
I think it starts, Greg, with the models around these services. I think I don't want to say lazy, but I think it's disingenuous to talk about financial health solutions when really the net impact of some of these services is to take more money out of people's pockets. I think we have to challenge ourselves within fintech, especially with so much technology and so much data and behavioral analysis available now, that we challenge ourselves to put services into people's hands that are actually having a net positive impact in terms of the funds that are actually available to consumer at the end of the year. Can we have a net positive impact in terms of the money that's available to this employee or this American at the end of the year? That, I think, is the start of real innovation in fintech. I think just moving money faster, charging a fee to it, I think that's relatively lazy from a model perspective. I also absolutely believe it's concerning from a regulatory perspective. I think there's a lot of innovation in the fintech space, and we as innovators have gotten quite a far ahead of the regulators. But as you know, as these services start to reach critical mass, absolutely the regulators are going to come and they're going to look at these services and they will protect consumers. And so that, I think, is exciting for a company like Instant that doesn't have any semantic trickery in our program to try to fool people out of their money so that they end up with less money at the end of the year after a year of using Instant. It's the exact opposite. We know that they end up with more money in their pockets. And I think the regulators are also going to help drive innovation, if you will, from a business model perspective to make sure that consumers and constituents are protected.
Sure. So what does the future look like for Instant Financial in regards to financial inclusion?
Well, like I was saying, this is really the bedrock of financial health for Instant, where we're providing timely access to earnings. And from there, we're able to help Americans better manage their spending effectively, ending up with more money at the end of the month instead of more month than money, and moving into savings and kind of really putting someone's money to work for them. And Greg, I think that's from a philosophy perspective, I believe that the vast majority of working Americans just work for their money. I think a lot of us in fintech take for granted that our money works for us. So we want to ultimately grow our service to the point of being real financial wellness, which that, from my perspective, we've achieved that when we have working Americans that their money's actually working for them. That's kind of the ultimate goal for Instant.
Well, Steve, we've covered a lot of ground on the company and financial inclusion. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much for focusing on financial inclusion. Thank you so much for spending some time to talk about the journey from financially vulnerable to coping and to health and financial wellness. What a great, great topic. And I appreciate you including me in the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I know your time's very valuable, so I appreciate you being here and sharing all your insights about this important topic. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Leaders in Payments podcast. guest. Make sure you visit our website at leadersinpayments.com, where you can subscribe to the show and where you'll find our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please share on your social channels as well.